That day, as she looked in the mirror in her wedding dress, Amara never imagined that in just a few minutes, she would discover the most painful betrayal of her life. A betrayal that came not only from the man she was about to call husband, but also from the woman she considered her sister. But before we dive into this story that will change your perspective on love, betrayal, and the human capacity to rise from the ashes, I need to ask you a favor. If you like stories of overcoming challenges that touch the soul, of women who find strength in the darkest moments, of love that arrives when you least expect it, then this channel is for you. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss any stories that remind you that there's always hope after the storm. And now, let me tell you about Amara, about Valerie, about Daniel, and about how a wedding that was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives became the starting point toward their true freedom. Tell me in the comments which country you're listening from as I take you on this emotional journey that will take your breath away. It all started when Amara was 17. It was an October afternoon in high school when she met Valerie. Amara was sitting alone in the cafeteria, reading one of those romance books that transported her to worlds where love always triumphed. Her dark curls cascaded over her shoulders, and her honey-colored eyes shone with that natural warmth that made people feel safe around her. Valerie appeared like a burst of golden light. Her blonde hair seemed to capture every ray of sunlight that filtered through the windows, and her blue eyes had that magnetism that made everyone turn to look at her. But that afternoon, instead of sitting with the popular group that always surrounded her, she headed straight for Amara. "I'll sit you here, if you don't mind," he said with a smile that seemed genuine. "My day has been terrible, and your face gives me peace." From then on, they were inseparable. Valerie told her that her parents were getting divorced, that she felt lost between the expectations of being perfect and the emptiness she felt inside. Amara, with her understanding nature, listened without judgment. For the next 5 years, they shared everything: sleepless nights talking about their dreams, afternoons of shopping where Valerie insisted on buying Amara pretty clothes, weekend trips to the beach where Amara took care of Valerie when she drank too much, and Valerie protected Amara from boys who only wanted to take advantage of her sweetness. Amara studied graphic design and found a job at a small advertising agency. She loved creating visual worlds that told stories. Valerie, meanwhile, worked as a freelance model and public relations professional. Her beauty opened doors for her, but Amara was always her emotional refuge. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Valerie told him on those nights when the world seemed too heavy. "You're the only person who truly knows me." Everything changed one Friday night in March. Amara had gone out alone to a cultural cafe downtown, one of those intimate places that featured live music and poetry. Valerie didn't like those environments. She preferred elegant bars where she could shine. But that night, Amara needed solitude and art. She was sitting at a small table near the stage, holding a coffee that had already cooled, when a man approached her table. He was tall, with slightly tousled brown hair and green eyes that seemed to hold stories. He was wearing a worn leather jacket and had that shy smile that Amara had always found irresistible. "Excuse me," he said in a soft voice, "is this chair taken? All the other seats are full." He sat down and extended his hand. "I'm Daniel," he said, "and you have the face of someone who understands art." Amara laughed, a genuine laugh that filled the space between them. "I'm Amara, and the truth is, I came here to escape a horrible week at work." Daniel was an architect, but his true passion was photography. He showed her some photos on his phone. Images of abandoned buildings, children playing in forgotten parks, sunsets from impossible angles. "You're incredible," he said, unable to help himself. "You have an eye for capturing beauty where no one else sees it." Daniel looked at her intensely. "Like you," he replied. "You have that beauty that doesn't need filters or stages. It's real." That night they talked until the cafe closed. They walked through the empty streets, sharing stories, dreams, and fears. When Daniel walked her back to her apartment, Amara knew something fundamental had changed in her life. The next day, he couldn't wait to tell Valerie. Metzi, he called her early. With that excitement you only feel when you think you've found something extraordinary. "Okay, you have to meet someone," he said as soon as Valerie answered the phone. "I met a guy last night and he's different." Valerie arrived at her apartment an hour later with coffee and croissants, as she did every time they had something important to discuss. Amara told her every detail of the previous night, and Valerie listened with that affectionate smile she always had for her friend's enthusiasm. "I'm glad to see you so happy," he said. "It's been a while since I've seen you shine like this. When will I get to meet him?" Amara didn't hesitate for a second. That same weekend, she organized a dinner party at her apartment. She wanted the two most important people in her life to meet and get along. But from the moment Daniel walked into her apartment and saw Valerie, Amara noticed something she couldn't quite interpret. A pause that seemed too long in her eyes. A smile that lasted a second longer than usual. "Daniel, meet Valerie, my best friend," Amara told him proudly. "Okay, this is Daniel, the guy I told you about." When Daniel took her hand, Amara saw something that made her uncomfortable without knowing why. The way he looked at her, as if he were seeing something that surprised him. And the way Valerie held his hand a second longer than necessary. Dinner passed normally. Daniel and Valerie chatted politely but distantly. But Amara, who knew Valerie better than anyone, noticed something forced in her demeanor. That night, after Daniel left, Valerie stayed behind to help her clean. "So, what did you think?" Amara asked, as she dried the dishes. Valerie was slow to respond, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "He's very sweet, Amara, and you can tell he's crazy about you." But Amara insisted, because she knew that tone. "No buts," Valerie replied. "He seems like a good guy to me. Just take care of yourself, okay? Men like him are sometimes too good to be true." The following months were the happiest of Amara's life. Daniel became her world without her losing her independence. He supported her work projects and listened to her talk about her dreams of having her own design agency. What Amara liked most was the way Daniel saw her. Not as someone who needed to be fixed or improved, but as perfect just the way she was. "Amara, you have something most people don't," he told her one afternoon as they walked through the park. "You have the ability to make everyone around you feel important, heard, loved. That's a gift." But as she had always done since they met, Amara included Valerie in almost all of her plans. Dinners at restaurants, movie nights, parties, weekend trips. Valerie was always there. "I'm glad you have a friend like Valerie," Daniel told her one day. "It's good to know you have someone to look out for you when I'm not around." What Amara didn't see was the way Valerie watched Daniel when she wasn't looking. The way her eyes lingered on his hands when he gestured while talking. The way she bit her lip when he laughed, that infectious laugh of his. Daniel, for his part, was cordial with Valerie but maintained a certain distance. Amara attributed this to the fact that he was more reserved, that he needed time to open up to new people. She didn't realize that Daniel had noticed something in the way Valerie looked at him. As Amara and Daniel's relationship grew stronger, Valerie began to change in very subtle ways. At first, Amara didn't notice. The changes were so small they seemed insignificant. Valerie started making seemingly innocent comments. When Amara told her about a minor argument she'd had with Daniel, Valerie would say things like, "Men always minimize what we feel. Are you sure he's really listening to you?" Or when Amara mentioned that Daniel had been working a lot, "Watch out, Amara. When a man starts prioritizing work over the relationship, it's because he's losing interest." These were comments that, if spoken by anyone else, Amara would have ignored. But they came from Valerie, her best friend, the person who knew her best, and who had always been there to protect her. Valerie also started dressing differently when she knew she was going to see Daniel. Tighter clothes, lower necklines, stronger perfumes. Whenever Amara made a comment, Valerie always had a logical explanation. "I bought this blouse for a job interview," she said. Or, "I got this perfume as a gift, so I'm trying it out." Most subtle and effective was the way Valerie had begun to position herself as Amara's emotional confidant. Whenever something wasn't perfect with Daniel, Valerie was there. "Did Daniel really say that to you?" she asked with feigned concern. "I find that odd, Amara. Men who truly love don't say things like that." And Amara, who had grown up with insecurities about her worth as a woman, began to doubt herself. Not about Daniel, exactly, but about whether she was enough for someone like him. The problem is that Valerie knew all of Amara's fears. She knew that she'd always believed she wasn't pretty enough, interesting enough, successful enough. The situation became complicated when Daniel landed an important project that required him to travel frequently. The trips were short, lasting 2 or 3 days, but for Amara, who was used to seeing him almost every day, they felt like eternities. Valerie took advantage of those moments. She would show up at Amara's apartment with wine and food, ready to keep her company. But instead of cheering her up, she subtly made her feel worse. "Don't you think it's strange that I'm traveling so much?" I said, pouring another glass of wine. "I mean, if I were him, I wouldn't want to be away from you for so long." Or, when Amara received messages from Daniel from his travels, "How lovely of you to write to me," Valerie said, reading over her friend's shoulder. "Although it's a rather formal message, don't you think?" The first real rift appeared one Friday night. Daniel had returned from a trip and was late for their date. He'd come straight from the airport, exhausted but eager to see her. When he arrived at the restaurant, Amara was waiting for him with an expression he didn't recognize. "Sorry, love," he said, kissing her on the cheek. "The flight was delayed and traffic was impossible." Amara looked at him coldly. "I've been waiting for an hour, Daniel. An hour sitting here like a fool." Daniel was surprised by her tone. He understood her anger, but the intensity of her anger seemed disproportionate. But Amara was already thinking about all the things Valerie had said to her during the week, about men not prioritizing their partners, about the importance of showing respect. "It's not just for today, Daniel," she said in a voice he didn't recognize. "It's for everything. I feel like I'm not a priority for you lately." Daniel looked at her, genuinely confused. "Amara, where did this come from? You know you're the most important thing in my life." That night, they ended up arguing for the first time seriously, and, for the first time, Amara stormed off a date with Daniel. The next day, Valerie showed up with ice cream and that understanding smile she always had for Amara's emotional crises. After that first serious fight, something changed in the dynamic between the three of them. Daniel, who had realized something was disturbing the peace of their relationship, began to make an extra effort to show Amara how much he loved her. But Valerie had developed a dangerous ability to reinterpret Daniel's every gesture of love as manipulative or insufficient. When Daniel gave Amara flowers, Valerie said, "That's sweet, but don't you think he's buying you off with gifts? Men who really change don't need to do things like that." And most damaging of all was how Valerie had begun to create situations where she was seen as the more stable, more available, more understanding option than Daniel. One Tuesday night, Amara had had a terrible day at work. Her boss had rejected a project she'd been working on for weeks, and she arrived home emotionally devastated. She texted Daniel, who was at an important business dinner, and he replied that he'd be out as soon as he could. Valerie appeared 20 minutes later with wine, Thai food, and shoulders to cry on. "Look, Amara," he said as he hugged her. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what. No matter if I have plans, if I have work, if I have anything. You're my priority." The message was clear, even if he never said it explicitly. Daniel had other priorities, but Valerie didn't. One afternoon, while Amara was at a work meeting, Valerie showed up at Daniel's study with coffee and pastries. "I thought you might need a break," she said with that smile she'd perfected over the years. "Amara told me you're super busy with the library project." Daniel, who had indeed been working since early in the morning, appreciated the gesture. They sat in his small office, surrounded by plans and photographs, and Valerie began asking questions about his work, demonstrating genuine interest. "It's incredible what you do," he said, looking at his photographs. "You have a way of seeing architecture that's almost poetic." Daniel enjoyed the conversation. It was refreshing to talk to someone who seemed to truly understand his artistic vision. Amara supported him unconditionally, but at times he felt she didn't fully understand his passion for abandoned urban spaces. "Amara told me you want to do an exhibition," Valerie continued. "It must be frustrating not having the time to fully dedicate yourself to what you're truly passionate about." Daniel looked at her in surprise. She had hit exactly the right note in his life. "Yes, sometimes I feel torn between what I need to do for a living and what I truly want to create." "I understand perfectly," Valerie replied. "I feel that way about modeling too. It's my job, but it's not my soul." That afternoon, they talked for 2 hours. Valerie left with the satisfaction of having planted something important, the idea that she understood him on a level Amara couldn't. When Amara arrived that evening, Daniel mentioned Valerie's visit. "It was very sweet of her," he said. "We talked about art and work. It's deeper than I thought." A month before the wedding, Valerie executed the most audacious part of her plan. During a dinner at Amara's house, where all three of them were present, she began talking about marriage in general. "Have you talked about everything important?" he asked casually. kids, money, where you're going to live, that sort of thing. And she continued asking questions that exposed the small differences that existed between them. They weren't irreconcilable differences, but, in Valerie's words, they sounded like unbridgeable chasms. What about children? How many do you want? When Amara and Daniel exchanged glances, it was one of those conversations they'd had briefly, but never in depth. We want children, Daniel said. In a few years, yes, Amara added, when we're more established. But how many years? Valerie insisted. 2, 5, 10. I don't know, Amara replied, feeling a growing unease. We haven't decided exactly. That night, after Valerie left, Amara and Daniel had their second serious argument. The situation came to a head 2 weeks before the wedding, when Amara asked Daniel to postpone the ceremony. Daniel looked at her as if she'd just told him the world had ended. What? Why? Because I'm not sure we're right for each other, Amara replied. And Valerie's words came out of her mouth as if they were her own. Daniel desperately tried to understand what had changed, what he'd done wrong, how they could fix it. But Amara had a ready answer for each of his questions. Answers Valerie had been refining for months. Where's this coming from, Amara? Daniel asked desperately. A week ago you were excited about the wedding. What changed? I realized we don't know each other as well as I thought, Amara replied, almost repeating the words Valerie had used. We have fundamental differences that we've never resolved. In the end, Daniel left that night without understanding what had happened to the woman he loved. But something unexpected happened. Instead of postponing the wedding, Amara decided to go ahead. 2 days later, she called Daniel and told him she'd been exaggerating, that she was just having pre-wedding jitters. What Amara didn't know was that Valerie had calculated that exact reaction. She knew that moment of hesitation would have created a fracture that she could exploit at exactly the right moment. On the wedding day, the day dawned perfect, as if the universe had decided to be cruel to its beauty. Amara woke up early, but instead of feeling the joy she had imagined for months, she felt a knot in her stomach she couldn't explain. At 9 in the morning, she arrived at the estate accompanied by her mother and bridesmaids. The place was transformed. The gardens had been decorated with thousands of white and gold flowers. There was something magical about the atmosphere, as if it were the perfect setting for the fairy tale Amara had dreamed of since she was a child. The dressing room was on the second floor of the main house, with huge windows overlooking the garden where the ceremony would be held. Her bridesmaids arrived one by one, filling the room with laughter and champagne. And of course, Valerie, who had arrived wearing a golden dress that made her look like a goddess. As the makeup artist worked on her face, Amara watched Valerie in the mirror. There was something different about her that day, an energy, an intensity she hadn't seen before. As if that day was as important to her as it was to Amara. At 11, when she was completely dressed, Valerie asked to speak to her alone. Amara, before all this starts, I want to tell you something. Valerie began with a seriousness that surprised her friend. Valerie told her she was the most important person in her life, that everything she'd ever done was because she loved her. There was something in her tone that made Amara feel uncomfortable, but she didn't have time to process those words. 15 minutes left. The coordinator announced. Amara looked at herself in the mirror one last time. She looked good. She felt good. The doubts of the past few months seemed far away. This was her day, her moment, her decision. Valerie left the room to check that the other bridesmaids were ready. Amara stayed alone for a few minutes, enjoying the calm before the ceremony. 5 minutes, someone shouted from below. Amara took a deep breath, picked up her bouquet of white and gold flowers, and headed for the door. Her bridesmaids were waiting for her in the aisle, all smiling and excited. You look amazing, they said in chorus. But when Amara looked for Valerie among them, she couldn't find her. Where's Vale? She asked. She came down a while ago, one of her cousins replied. She said she was going to check something out. They began to walk slowly down the stairs. Her father appeared at her side, elegant in his tuxedo, his eyes brimming with tears of pride. Ready, my love? He asked, offering her his arm. Ready, Amara replied with a smile that came from her heart. But when they reached the top of the stairs, the event coordinator approached them with a worried expression. Excuse me, Miss Amara, he said quietly. There's a small problem. What kind of problem? His father asked. It's the boyfriend, the coordinator replied, clearly uncomfortable. He's not in his place. We saw him heading toward the back garden a few minutes ago. With whom? Amara asked, although a part of her already knew the answer. With one of the bridesmaids, the blonde one, Valerie. Amara felt as if the world had stopped around her. I must have misunderstood, her father said, trying to remain calm. But Amara already knew. I'm going to find him, she said in a voice she didn't recognize as her own. Her steps automatically led her toward the path that circled the main house and led to the back garden, a more private area with vine-covered pergolas and benches tucked among the flowers. When she turned the corner and saw the pergola half-covered with white jasmine, her world stopped forever. Daniel was there, but he wasn't in a bad way and didn't need help. He was standing next to one of the pergola's pillars, his hands on Valerie's waist. Her hands were on his chest, and their lips were connected in a kiss that was neither accidental nor innocent. It was a lover's kiss, a kiss between people who had been waiting for this moment, who knew each other intimately, who had done this before. Amara froze, watching the scene as if it were a slow-motion movie. She could see every detail with brutal clarity. The way Daniel's fingers dug into the fabric of Valerie's gold dress, the way she had one leg slightly raised, the fact that they both had their eyes closed as if lost in the moment. The sound of footsteps behind her brought her out of her trance. She turned and saw that some guests had followed the same path as her. Her cousin Laura, a couple of Daniel's friends, her uncle Roberto, they all froze at the sight. And then they started taking out their phones. The sound of phones snapping photos and videos was what finally made Daniel and Valerie break up. They turned to the group of accidental witnesses, and Amara saw the exact moment they both realized what had happened. Daniel paled. Valerie, for a second, had an expression Amara couldn't interpret. It wasn't exactly embarrassment, nor regret. It was something more complex, as if a part of her had been waiting for that moment of revelation. Amara, Daniel whispered, taking a step toward her. But Amara raised her hand, stopping him. Her bouquet of flowers trembled in her other hand, but her voice, when she finally spoke, came out clear and firm. Don't say anything, he said. There's nothing you can say that will erase what I just saw. He turned to Valerie, who for the first time in all the years they had known each other, couldn't meet his gaze. And you, Amara continued, thank you for showing me who you are before I called you family. The silence that followed was broken only by the continuous sound of cell phones recording. Amara knew that within minutes, those images would be all over social media, that the humiliation would be public and permanent. But at that moment, he didn't care. At that moment, he just felt a strange sense of liberation. She dropped the bouquet to the stone floor and turned to the guests who had witnessed the scene. The wedding is off, she announced clearly. You can go home. And without looking back, without giving Daniel or Valerie a chance to explain or apologize, she walked back toward the main house, her head held high and her white dress flowing behind her. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, messages of condolence, and the constant humiliation of knowing that her personal tragedy had gone viral on social media. Videos and photos of the moment had circulated on every platform. The bride who discovered the betrayal on her wedding day had become a trending topic. There were memes, cruel comments, but also an army of women supporting her. Amara had locked herself in her apartment with the curtains closed and her phone on silent. Her mother came every day to bring her food and check on her physically, but emotionally, Amara felt as if she had died on her wedding day. Daniel had tried to contact her countless times. Texts, calls, emails, he'd even shown up at her door. But Amara didn't want to hear any explanation. The most painful thing wasn't just Daniel's betrayal, it was Valerie's. The person she had trusted blindly for years had been manipulating their relationship from day one. A week after the canceled wedding, Amara finally agreed to see Daniel. They met at a neutral cafe, far from the neighborhood where they both lived. Daniel looked terrible. He had lost weight, had deep dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes were wrinkled. Amara, he began, I know I have no right to ask you to listen to me, but I need you to know what you saw. It wasn't the first time, Amara interrupted. Her voice was flat, emotionless. It was a statement, not a question. Daniel lowered his head. No, he admitted, it had happened before. How many times? 3 times, he finally whispered. During the last 2 months, Amara felt like she'd been stabbed in the stomach. The last 2 months while we were planning our wedding, Daniel then told her about the months of psychological manipulation he'd suffered at the hands of Valerie, how she'd appeared at specific moments when he was vulnerable, how she'd planted doubts about Amara's love. But she also realized something else. Daniel had chosen to believe Valerie instead of speaking to her directly. He had chosen betrayal over communication. Daniel, she finally told him, I understand that she manipulated you, but you chose to kiss her. You chose to betray me, not once, but 3 times. He stood up from the table. I don't need you to live with guilt, Daniel. I just need you to leave me alone. 2 weeks after meeting Daniel, Valerie finally tried to contact Amara. She showed up at her apartment on a Sunday afternoon. Valerie looked different. She was still beautiful, but there was something broken in her expression. Her blue eyes, which had always been her most powerful weapon, now seemed dull. They sat in the living room where they had spent so many nights talking about their dreams, where they had been best friends. Now, the space felt tainted by betrayal. I was in love with Daniel from the first day I met him, Valerie confessed. From the moment he walked into your apartment that night, I knew he was the man I'd been waiting for my whole life. Since day 1, Amara asked. Yes, Valerie continued. But he only had eyes for you, and I couldn't stand it. Valerie then told him the whole truth. How she had manipulated them both for months, how she had used her intimate knowledge of Amara's insecurities to create doubts about Daniel. At first, I just wanted to create some doubts between you, Valerie explained. I thought if I could get you to argue a little, maybe Daniel would realize you weren't that compatible. But when that didn't work, I decided to be more direct. Valerie told him how she'd started visiting Daniel in his studio, always with perfect excuses. She'd bring him coffee when she knew Amara wouldn't be there, offered to help him with projects, and talk to him about art in a way that made him feel understood. He resisted at first, Valerie admitted. For months, he rejected any advances, but I knew he'd eventually give in. All men give in if you apply the right pressure at the right time. And what was that moment? Amara asked, although part of her didn't want to know. The night after you two had that terrible fight about postponing the wedding, Valerie replied. Daniel was devastated, confused. He showed up at my apartment after midnight, drunk and crying. He said he didn't understand what he'd done wrong, that he felt like he was losing you. Amara remembered that night. Daniel had gone out after the fight and hadn't returned until the next day. When she asked him where he'd been, he told her he'd gone to a bar to think. Technically, he hadn't lied, but he had omitted a crucial part of the truth. I comforted him, Valerie continued shamelessly. I told him you didn't know how to value what you had, that you were too immature to understand a man like him. And when he was most vulnerable, when he most needed to feel desired, I gave him exactly that. Was that the first time you two kissed? Amara asked. Yes, Valerie replied. And afterward, he felt so guilty he almost begged me not to tell you. He promised it would never happen again. But did it happen again? Valerie smiled with an expression Amara had never seen on her before. A cold, calculating smile. Of course, it happened again. Because once you cross that line, it's easier to cross it again. And I made sure I was there every time he doubted you, every time he felt misunderstood, every time he needed someone to make him feel special. The second time was a week later, when you were working late on that important presentation. Daniel texted me saying he felt lonely, that he missed the simpler times between youths. I went to his apartment with wine, and that listening skill I'd honed over the years. And the third time was 3 days before the wedding, when you were so stressed with the final preparations that you barely spoke to him. He was second-guessing everything, wondering if you really wanted to get married or if you were just following a trend. I showed him there were other options. Amara felt nauseous listening to every detail, but she needed to know everything. And on the wedding day, Amara continued, I planned that, Valerie admitted without a trace of regret. I knew you'd come looking for him when he wasn't at the altar. I knew you'd find us. Did you want me to discover you? Valerie nodded slowly. She wanted it all to be over. She couldn't keep living that lie. But also, if I'm honest, I wanted you to see that he chose me at the most important moment of your life. But then Valerie made a confession that changed everything. I've always been in love with you, she confessed. Since that first afternoon in the school cafeteria, everything I've done all these years has been to be near you. Amara felt nauseous. Everything began to make sense in a twisted, horrible way. The intensity of Valerie's friendship, her need to always be there, her resistance to Amara's serious relationships. "Daniel was just a way to have you," Valerie continued. "If he couldn't be your partner, at least he could be the most important person in your life. But when he came along and I saw the way you looked at him, the way you glowed when you talked about him, I knew I'd lost everything." "So you decided to destroy my relationship?" Amara said, not as a question, but as a statement. "I decided that if I couldn't have you, no one else could make you completely happy," Valerie replied. "It was selfish, I know. But seeing your happiness with him was slowly killing me." "You don't love me, Valerie," Amara told her, with a clarity that surprised even her. "What you're describing isn't love, it's obsession." "What's the difference?" Valerie asked, tears in her eyes. "The difference is that when you love someone, you want the best for them, even if it means they won't be with you," Amara replied. "You destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because you couldn't stand to see me happy with someone else." Amara stood up from the couch, feeling a strange calm she hadn't felt in weeks. "You can't fix it, Valerie," he said, his voice firmer than he'd expected. "What you did can't be fixed, but what you can do is get out of my life for good." "Amara, please," Valerie begged. "We can get through this. We're sisters. Remember, we've been through worse." "Forever, Valerie," Amara repeated, heading for the door to open it. "I don't want to see you again. I don't want you calling me. I don't want you to just show up in the places I go. If you really love me, like you say, respect my decision." Valerie stood up slowly, as if every movement hurt. At the door, she turned around one last time. "Will you ever be able to forgive me?" she asked in a broken voice. "I don't know," Amara replied honestly. "But what I do know is that it's not my responsibility to make you feel better about what you did." She closed the door behind Valerie and locked it, knowing she had just closed the most painful chapter of her life forever. The months that followed were the most difficult of Amara's life. Not only did she have to process the betrayal and pain, but she also had to rebuild her identity from scratch. She began therapy with a psychologist specializing in trauma and emotional manipulation. The first sessions were devastating. She had to confront not only the recent betrayal, but also patterns of behavior dating back to her childhood. During therapy, she discovered that her need to please others, her tendency to doubt her own perceptions, and her fear of abandonment had created the perfect environment for someone like Valerie to manipulate her for years. Her therapist, Dr. Ramirez, explained the concept of psychological manipulation to her in a way that finally made sense of everything she had been through. Emotional manipulators like Valerie are experts at identifying their victims' insecurities, she told him during a particularly intense session. They use those insecurities as levers to control behaviors and emotions. And the most dangerous thing is that they do it so gradually that the victim doesn't realize it until it's too late. Amara had to learn to distinguish between her own feelings and the feelings Valerie had implanted in her for years. It was a painful process of untangling her own voice from the critical voice Valerie had cultivated in her head. She also had to face the grieving process, not only for the lost relationship with Daniel, but also for the friendship she had thought she had with Valerie. She realized she was actually mourning something that had never really existed. "The person I thought was my best friend was a construct, a mask carefully designed to manipulate me," she tearfully told her therapist. "I'm grieving for a relationship that was never real." During this process, Amara made important decisions about her life. She quit her job at the advertising agency, a place that constantly reminded her of the time when Valerie was a part of every important decision she made. She decided to pursue her dream of owning her own graphic design business. It was something she had put off for years, always finding excuses or waiting for the perfect moment. Now she realized that the perfect moment would never come on its own. She moved. She couldn't continue living in the apartment that held so many memories of Valerie and Daniel. She found a smaller but brighter place in a different neighborhood. In Palermo, near parks and cafes that bore no relation to her previous life. She decorated the new apartment entirely according to her own tastes, without considering anyone else's opinions. Colors she truly loved, furniture that reflected her personality, art that inspired her. For the first time in her life, she created a space that was completely hers. For the first time in her life, Amara began to develop a real relationship with herself. She discovered that she liked solitude, that she could go to the movies alone without feeling awkward, that she could travel alone and enjoy it, that she could make important decisions without needing validation from others. He began to do things he'd never done before. He took ceramics classes at a workshop in Barucas, where he connected with the joy of creating something beautiful with his own hands. He learned to play the guitar, something he'd always wanted to do, but which Valerie had discouraged, telling him he had no ear for music. She joined a mountaineering club and discovered she loved the feeling of physical challenge and the peace she found in nature. She made her first trek to Bariloche and cried with joy at the top of a mountain, not out of sadness but from the immense sense of freedom she felt. She wasn't trying to fill a void, but rather genuinely wanted to explore parts of herself she'd never had the chance to explore. Without Valerie's constant influence, she discovered she was a much more adventurous and independent person than she'd believed. A year after the cancelled wedding, Amara realized she didn't think about Daniel or Valerie every day. The pain was still there, but it was no longer the center of her existence. She had built a life that was completely hers. Her design firm was growing. She had landed some important clients, including a restaurant chain that had hired her to redesign its entire visual image. She was building a solid reputation in the industry, and, more importantly, she was doing work she was truly passionate about. But most importantly, she had learned to love herself. Not in a narcissistic or selfish way, but in a healthy and compassionate way. She had learned that she was complete on her own, that she didn't need another person to define her worth or her happiness. It was during this time of personal reconstruction that Amara met Ethan. She wasn't looking for him. In fact, she had consciously decided she wasn't ready for a romantic relationship. But sometimes, life has other plans. It was a Saturday afternoon in April, and Amara was in an independent bookstore downtown. Ateneo, grand, splendid, looking for books on entrepreneurship. She was in the business section, poring over the back covers of several books, when someone next to her commented, "This one is great for getting started, but if you already have some experience, I'd recommend this one. It's more advanced, but much more practical." Amara looked up and saw a tall man with brown hair, slightly graying at the temples, kind brown eyes, and a genuine smile. He wasn't conventionally handsome like Daniel had been, but there was something about his presence that immediately put her at ease. A quiet confidence, a calm she hadn't seen in many people. "Do you have experience with entrepreneurship?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Something like that," he replied modestly. "I have a small consulting firm. I help entrepreneurs structure their businesses, especially in the early years, which are the most critical." He introduced himself as Ethan, and when he learned Amara was building her own design company, his eyes lit up with genuine interest. Not the forced kind he'd learned to recognize, but genuine curiosity. "How long have you had the company?" he asked. "A year and a half," Amara replied. "I started after a major change in my life." Ethan didn't press for details, which Amara immediately appreciated. What followed was a 2-hour conversation in the bookstore's cafe. But it wasn't like those awkward first dates where two people try to impress each other with edited versions of themselves. It was a conversation between two adults who had lived long enough to know who they were and what they wanted out of life. Ethan told her he'd been married for 10 years, that the marriage had ended amicably when they both realized they'd grown in different directions. There was no drama, no betrayal, just the sad but mature reality that sometimes love isn't enough to keep two people together who no longer want the same things. "We married very young," he explained. "We were good people who loved each other, but we never took the time to discover who we were as individuals. When we finally did, we realized we were quite incompatible." Amara told him about her company, about her dreams of expanding internationally, about the challenges she was facing with difficult clients, and the fierce competition in the design market. She didn't tell him about Daniel or Valerie, not because she was consciously hiding anything, but because that part of her story no longer defined who she was in the present. When they said goodbye that afternoon, Ethan asked her if she'd like to have coffee the following week. Not as a date, he clarified with a smile, but because he'd really enjoyed the conversation and thought they could help each other professionally. Amara accepted, and that second conversation led to a third, and then a fourth. For weeks, they met regularly, but always under the guise of work. They exchanged professional advice, recommended contacts, and discussed business strategies. But slowly, inevitably, something more began to grow between them. Ethan was different from any man Amara had ever met. He wasn't dramatic or intense like Daniel had been. There weren't moments of overwhelming passion followed by existential doubts. Instead, there was a consistency, a stability that Amara found deeply attractive. He was reliable in small but significant ways. He arrived when he said he would. He did what he promised. If he said he would call, he called. If he said he would send an email, he sent it. These seemed like simple things, but for someone who had lived with years of manipulation and inconsistency, that reliability was revolutionary. He was also 8 years older than her, and that age difference meant he'd been through his own crises and come out the other side with a wisdom that only comes from experience. He wasn't trying to find himself or prove anything to anyone. He knew who he was and was comfortable with that person. The most important thing was that Ethan didn't need her to be different than she was. He wasn't trying to fix her, change her, or fill some void in his own life through her. He saw her as a whole, independent person, which was exactly what she had worked so hard to become. The first time they kissed was 3 months after they'd known each other. They'd been working late in Ethan's office, refining a presentation for an important client of Amara. Their small downtown office was lit only by desk lamps, and outside Buenos Aires glittered with nightlights. When they finally finished, it was already past midnight. Amara packed her things in her bag, grateful but exhausted. "Thank you," he said, as he put away the last few sheets. "I don't know how I would have done it without your help. This client is super demanding." Ethan looked at her with that soft smile that had become so familiar to her. "You're incredible, Amara," he said, with a sincerity that took her by surprise. "Your talent, your determination, your ability to rebuild yourself after whatever you've been through before. You are truly incredible." Something about the way he looked at her, the genuine admiration in his eyes, made Amara realize she'd fallen for him without even realizing it. It hadn't been a bolt of lightning that had suddenly struck her, but something that had grown slowly, like a plant that puts down deep roots before blooming. She approached him slowly, giving him time to move away if he wanted, but he didn't move away. Instead, he gently placed his hands on her face and kissed her with a tenderness that made her cry. They weren't tears of sadness, but tears of relief. After so much pain, so much mistrust, so much lonely healing, she had finally found someone who loved her for who she truly was, unconditionally, without manipulation, without a hidden agenda. Her relationship with Ethan grew slowly, steadily, like a tree that puts down deep roots before blossoming. Amara had learned from her past mistakes and was in no hurry to prematurely disrupt all areas of her life. For the first time in a relationship, she kept parts of herself separate and private. She had her business, her friends from the mountaineering club, her pottery classes, and her relationship with Ethan. Each area was important, but none fully defined who she was. Ethan respected that independence in a way Daniel never had. He had his own full life, his own friends, his own interests. He played tennis on Thursdays, had an amateur jazz band he played with on weekends, and voraciously read Argentine history books. They complemented each other without desperately needing each other. And that difference was revolutionary for Amara. There was no drama, no jealousy, no constant need for validation. There was mutual respect, genuine admiration, and a love that felt secure. During the first year of their relationship, Amara gradually told him about her past, about Valerie, about Daniel, about the manipulation and betrayal. Ethan listened without judgment, without trying to fix anything, without minimizing her pain. "I'm so sorry," he said, when she finished telling him the whole story one night over dinner at his apartment. "No one deserves to go through that. But I'm glad you came out stronger on the other side." But he didn't try to rescue her from her pain, nor did he promise that he would never hurt her. Instead, he showed her with consistent actions, day after day, that he was a trustworthy person. Not with grand romantic gestures, but with small, consistent displays of respect and affection. It was exactly 2 years after they met that Ethan proposed to her. It wasn't dramatic or public. It was a Sunday morning in September, while they were having breakfast on the terrace of their apartment in Palermo, reading the newspaper and enjoying the spring sun that was beginning to warm up after the winter. "Amara," he said suddenly, closing the culture section of LA Nation. "I've been thinking about something." "What?" she asked, looking up from her computer, where she was checking work emails. "A weekend habit she knew she needed to change. I'd love to spend the rest of my life having breakfast like this with you." Amara laughed, a genuine laugh that filled the terrace. "That's a very unromantic way to propose to me." Ethan smiled and pulled a simple ring from his pocket. "Would you prefer I get down on one knee and make a dramatic speech about destiny and soulmates?" Amara looked at the ring. It was simple, elegant, completely different from the ring Daniel had given her years ago. It had no color-changing stones or unique designs meant to impress. It was simply beautiful in its simplicity, like the relationship they had built. "No," he replied with a smile that came from his heart. "I prefer this. I prefer it to be real, to be honest, to be ours." "Is that a yes?" Ethan asked. "It's a yes," Amara replied. And when he put the ring on it, she knew this time was different. This time, it was forever. Not because of empty promises, but because of the solidity of what they had built together. 2 years after her engagement to Ethan, on a bright spring afternoon, Amara was heading to a meeting with a potential client in Puerto Madero. Her company had grown so much that it now had 10 employees, and she was considering opening a second office, possibly in Cordoba, to be closer to clients in the interior. She decided to arrive early and have lunch at a fancy cafe near the building where the meeting would be held. She walked in holding hands with Ethan, who had decided to join her that afternoon because he had a meeting of his own in the area. As they waited for a table, Amara felt completely at peace. Her life had found a balance she'd never imagined possible. She had a successful business that fulfilled her professionally, a solid relationship built on real foundations, and genuine friends she'd met through her own interests, not by association. She'd built something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. It was then that he heard a voice he immediately recognized, a voice he hadn't heard in almost 5 years. Amara. She turned slowly, and there they were. Daniel and Valerie, sitting at a corner table, clearly as surprised to see her as she was to see them. The years that had passed had left their mark on both of them, but in very different ways than they had affected Amara. Daniel looked older, thinner, with tired lines around his eyes that I didn't remember. His clothes, though presentable, weren't as meticulously cared for as I remembered. There was something defeated about his posture, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. Valerie, though still beautiful, had lost that golden glow she'd always had. Her eyes had a dullness that hadn't been there before, and there was something forced about her smile. She looked like someone who was acting happy but didn't really mean it. They approached slowly, clearly, unsure of how to handle the situation. "Hi, Amara," Daniel said hesitantly. "You look great." And it was true. Amara radiated a confidence and peace she hadn't had when they'd first met. It wasn't the forced happiness of someone trying to prove a point, but the genuine serenity of someone comfortable with themselves. "Thank you," he replied calmly, without a trace of the bitterness he might have expected to feel. Ethan, who had been watching the interaction with curiosity but not anxiety, subtly approached and placed a protective but not possessive hand on Amara's back. Amara briefly introduced herself. "Ethan, this is Daniel and Valerie." "Daniel, Valerie, this is Ethan, my fiancé." The word fiancé struck Daniel visibly. His eyes automatically went to the ring on Amara's hand, a different ring from the one he had given her, a ring that represented something entirely different. "Congratulations," he murmured, and seemed genuinely pleased despite the pain that was obvious in his eyes. Valerie didn't say anything, but Amara could see she was struggling with complex emotions. There was something in her expression that suggested regret, but also an envy that hadn't completely disappeared over the year. "How have you been?" Amara asked, more out of politeness than genuine interest. Daniel swallowed before answering. We've been together." Amara looked between the two, noticing for the first time that they didn't seem like a happy couple. There was tension between them, an awkwardness that suggested the relationship they'd built on betrayal hadn't turned out to be what they'd hoped. "We got married a year ago," Valerie added, her voice trying to sound cheerful but coming out hollow. Amara felt a pang, not of pain, but of something close to pity. She realized that Daniel and Valerie had gotten what they thought they wanted, but clearly hadn't found the happiness they'd hoped for. "I'm happy for you," he said, and although the words sounded automatic, there was an underlying sincerity. He wasn't happy because they were together, but because he no longer cared enough to wish them ill. Daniel looked at her intently, as if he were trying to decipher something. "Amara, I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. Not a day went by that I didn't regret what I did." Amara looked at him calmly, without rancor, but also without the compassion he might have hoped for. "Daniel, it doesn't matter anymore. What happened between us taught me important things about myself, about what I want in life, about how to value myself." Ethan, who had remained silent but attentive, subtly approached. That simple gesture contrasted dramatically with everything Daniel and Valerie stood for. Where there had been drama and manipulation, there was now stability. Where there had been insecurity and jealousy, there was now mutual trust. Valerie, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "Amara, I wanted to tell you I'm sorry too. What I did was unforgivable." Amara looked at her, seeing not the woman who had been her best friend for years, but a stranger who had caused so much harm. "Valerie, you're right, it was unforgivable. But it also doesn't matter anymore. I carried that with me for too long, and I finally let it go. Will you forgive us?" Daniel asked, hopefully. Amara considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was a complex issue, something she had worked on extensively in therapy for years. "I forgive you in the sense that I no longer carry anger toward you," he finally replied. "But that doesn't mean I want you to be a part of my life, or that what you did was right." Daniel nodded, understanding the distinction. Valerie looked as if she wanted to say something more, but remained silent. "I hope they can be happy," Amara added, and realized she meant it. Not because she particularly wished them well, but because she no longer had any emotional energy invested in their lives. She walked over to Ethan, taking his arm. "It was unexpected to see you, but we have an important meeting." As they walked away, Amara heard Daniel say quietly, "Let them be happy if they can." The words stopped her for a moment. It was exactly what she had told them years ago, on the day of their canceled wedding. But now, coming from him, they sounded like an admission that they had failed to find the happiness they had pursued through betrayal. Amara didn't turn around. Instead, she continued walking toward her future, with Ethan at her side. Once outside the cafeteria, Ethan asked her gently, "Are you okay?" Amara breathed deeply, feeling the fresh Buenos Aires air in her lungs. "I'm more than fine," she replied. "I'm free." And it was true. The encounter had closed a circle she didn't know she needed to close. She had seen the people who had once been the center of her universe, and realized they no longer had power over her. She hadn't felt the anger she'd feared, nor the sadness she'd expected. She'd only felt deep gratitude for the path she'd taken, for the lessons she'd learned, for the woman she'd become. As they walked toward their meeting, hand in hand, Amara reflected on the strange path her life had taken. The betrayal she had believed would destroy her had ended up being the catalyst for her deepest transformation. She had lost a fiancé who turned out not to be the man she had thought he was. She had lost a best friend who had never really been her friend. But she had gained something far more valuable. She had found herself, and now she had something she'd never had before. A relationship built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine admiration. A relationship where she didn't have to pretend to be someone else. Where she didn't have to sacrifice parts of herself to keep the peace, where she was loved exactly as she was. That evening, after a successful meeting that had resulted in the largest contract in their company's history, Amara and Ethan had dinner at their favorite restaurant in Santa. It was a small, intimate place, very different from the fancy places she'd been to with Daniel, but it felt like home. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing that she had been quieter than usual during dinner. "How strange life is," Amara replied, playing with her fork on her plate of risotto. 5 years ago, if someone had told me that one day I'd look at Daniel and Valerie and feel nothing but indifference, I wouldn't have believed it. And now, I realize now that the pain they caused me was terrible, but it was also necessary," she reflected. "If Daniel hadn't betrayed me, I probably would have married him. And I would have been unhappy, because our relationship was built on weak foundations. I didn't know myself. I didn't know what I really wanted." Ethan took her hand across the table. "Sometimes the most painful things are the ones that teach us the most." "Exactly," Amara replied. "And the craziest thing is that now I can say I'm grateful. Not for the pain itself, but for what that pain taught me about myself, about my ability to bounce back, about what I truly value in a relationship." They remained silent for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The restaurant was slowly emptying, couples and families finishing their dinners and heading home. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Do you know what I admire most about you?" he said, looking her straight in the eyes. "That your ability to transform pain into wisdom," he replied. "Not everyone can do that. Most people stay stuck in bitterness or resentment for years. But you took the worst that happened to you and used it to become a better, stronger, more authentic person." Amara felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude, not just for Ethan, but for the entire journey she'd taken to get here. It wasn't easy, she told him. There were times, especially in the first few months after the wedding, when I thought I'd never get out of that darkness. There were days when I didn't want to get out of bed. But you came out, Ethan replied, with that soft smile he loved so much. And look at everything you've built. Your company, your new friendships, this version of you that's incredibly strong and at the same time vulnerable in all the right ways. Amara smiled, looking around. The restaurant was full of life, of lively conversations, of people enjoying simple but important moments. Life went on, beautiful and complicated, painful and wonderful, exactly as it should be. Yes, she finally said. I built something beautiful. And the craziest thing is that now I know I did it all by myself, with my own hands, with my own decisions. No one gave it to me, no one can take it away from me. And as Ethan squeezed her hand and looked at her with those eyes filled with genuine love and real admiration, Amara knew she had found exactly what she had been unknowingly searching for, an authentic life, built on truth, self-respect, and real love. Not the desperate, needy love she had with Daniel, but a mature, secure love that complimented her without defining her, that supported her without controlling her, that celebrated her without needing to change her. And so, after everything she'd been through, after the most painful betrayal and the most difficult rebuilding, she finally understood that true love doesn't always come when we desperately seek it, but it always comes when we're ready to receive it. When we've learned to love ourselves first, when we know who we are and what we deserve, when we are whole as individuals and can choose to share that wholeness with someone else, rather than looking for someone to fill our emptiness. 3 years later, Amara and Ethan married in a small, intimate ceremony at a country house in Tiger, surrounded only by the people who truly mattered in their lives. There was no drama, no manipulation, no last-minute second thoughts. Amara walked down the aisle with a genuine smile, without fear, without the anxiety she'd felt years before. This time, she knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. When Ethan watched her walk toward him, his eyes filled with tears of pure joy. And when they exchanged vows, they'd written themselves promising respect, honesty, and mutual growth. Amara knew she'd arrived exactly where she was meant to be. Her company continued to grow and expanded not only to Cordoba, but also to Chile. Amara became a leader in her industry, giving talks on entrepreneurship and resilience. She never publicly shared the details of her personal story, but her example of rebuilding inspired many women who had experienced similar betrayals, sometimes on quiet nights. While Ethan read beside her in bed and she finished reviewing some designs, Amara thought about all the journey she'd taken, about the insecure woman she'd been, the manipulation she'd endured, the pain she'd felt that April day when her world had collapsed. But she no longer felt bitterness, only profound gratitude for having found the strength to rebuild herself, to truly know herself, to create a life that was genuinely hers. Daniel and Valerie eventually divorced. 2 years after that encounter at the coffee shop, Amara found out by chance through mutual acquaintances, but the news didn't stir any particular emotion. They were people from her past, closed chapters of a story that no longer belonged to her. Valerie tried to contact her once more, sending a long email apologizing and explaining that she finally understood the hurt she had caused. Amara read the message, felt a slight sadness for the woman still carrying that guilt, but decided not to respond. Some wounds heal better in silence. Instead, she focused on her present and her future, on her strong marriage to Ethan, on their plans to adopt a child next year, on the trips they wanted to take together, on the dreams they shared. And so, after everything she'd been through, after the most painful betrayal and the most difficult rebuilding, Amara finally understood that true love doesn't always come when we desperately seek it, but it always comes when we're ready to receive it, when we've learned to love ourselves first, when we know who we are and what we deserve, when we are whole as individuals and can choose to share that wholeness with someone else, rather than looking for someone to fill our emptiness. Sometimes the deepest wounds become the roots of our greatest strength. Sometimes losing what we thought we wanted leads us to find what we truly needed. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most painful betrayals turn into the most unexpected blessings. Because, in the end, it's not about how many times we fall, but how many times we choose to get back up. It's not about the people who fail us, but about the person we become when we choose not to let those failures define us. Amara had learned the most important lesson of all, that self-love isn't selfishness, but survival. That knowing oneself isn't vanity, but wisdom. And that being whole before being accompanied isn't loneliness, but freedom. If this story touched your heart, if you recognized your own strength in Amara, or if you simply believe that everyone deserves a second chance at love, I would like to meet you. Tell me in the comments which country you're listening from. Which part of this story resonated with you the most? Was it the betrayal that changed everything, the strength to rebuild, or perhaps the encounter with a love that came when you least expected it? Like, if you believe that second chances exist, both in love and in life, share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that after the storm comes the sun, and that after the harshest winter comes spring. And if you've made it this far, if you've joined Amara on this journey of pain, growth, and rebirth, leave me the word reborn in the comments, because that's exactly what she did, and that's exactly what we can all do when life tests us. Subscribe for more stories that remind you that no matter how dark the night seems, there's always a new story waiting to be written. There's always a new chance at happiness, because in the end, all true love stories begin the same way, with someone who decided to love themselves first.